The Subcommittee on Information Technology and the Subcommittee on Government Operations will come to order, and without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Today, we're going to review GAO's designation of IT acquisition as high risk and highlight how the Federal Information Technology Reform Act, FITARA, can reduce IT acquisition risk. I represent a district that's 29 counties, very rural parts of Texas, and the urban part. Not once did I mention IT procurement on the campaign trail because it wasn't a sexy topic. And one of my first trips out in the district, we're in far west Texas, my chief of staff says, "What are you going to talk about?" And he says, "IT procurement." And his face goes ashen. But when you tell people that the federal government spends $80 billion on IT procurement, and a good majority of that is on legacy systems, they're pretty outraged. And they recognize the need for efficiency. They recognize the need to reduce the size and scope of the federal government. And FITARA was a good move in that direction. I think many of the folks on this panel were involved in that. You know, Darrell Issa and Congressman Connolly were instrumental in making that happen. And I'm looking forward to working with Congresswoman Kelly on this important issue and making sure, Mr. Scott, you have all the tools you need to do your job. You have a tough job. This is, I recognize the difficulty of the task, and IT management and acquisition has long been a problem for the federal government, and we all know that. And I'm hopeful that the agency CIOs will, in partnership with their C-suite agency colleagues, fundamentally transform the way the federal government manages and buys IT. We cannot afford to be having the same discussion about IT management and acquisition in another 20 years. Our fiscal situation demands that we take advantage of the opportunities for cost savings in IT, whether through eliminating duplication, transitioning to the cloud and shared services, or ensuring agile development. I'm particularly interested in how we might define successful FITARA implementation and how we best empower the CIOs for success. I look forward to working with the leadership and members of the IT and government operations subcommittees on both sides of the aisle to continue the oversight of FITARA implementation. We have to get this right, and I believe this is something that has support not only on both sides of the aisle here in the House and the Senate, in the White House as well. And now, I would like to recognize Ms. Kelly, our ranking member of the Subcommittee on Information Technology, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's oversight hearing on the implementation of the Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform Act, bipartisan legislation intended to overhaul the federal government's approach to managing its information technology resources and save billions of taxpayers' dollars. I would like to commend Representative Jerry Connolly, the ranking member of the Government Operations Subcommittee and co-author of this legislation, for his continued work on federal IT issues and reforms. I look forward to working with him and other members of the committee in conducting effective oversight of the implementation of this law across the government. FITARA includes a number of government-wide reforms for managing IT acquisitions and portfolios that will help ensure the federal government is making wise and efficient investment in IT. This committee plays an important oversight role that can increase transparency and accountability of agency efforts and help ensure that the law is effectively implemented. In February of this year, the Government Accountability Office released its biannual high-risk report, which added the new high-risk area, and I quote, "Improving the management of information technology acquisitions and operations." GAO found that federal government spends billions of dollars on failed or poorly performing IT investments. Effective oversight is a key tool in identifying and reducing this kind of wasteful spending. Congress has a duty to conduct oversight as well as an obligation to give agencies the tools they need to conduct their own oversight. Agencies need more well-trained acquisition personnel to effectively oversee complex systems and to ensure that the government is a smart and diligent consumer. FITARA recognizes this need. Congress must also ensure that agencies have the resources to hire and retain qualified personnel that embrace the added authority and additional responsibilities provided to chief information officers by this law. Congress, together with administration, should pursue ways to retain their expertise, train them in the most cutting-edge techniques, and support their critical work. In April 2015, OMB released for public comment proposed guidance on how agencies are to implement FITARA. Today, after soliciting public feedback and conducting numerous outreach sessions with stakeholders and experts, OMB issued its final guidance to agencies on the management and oversight of information technology resources. I want to thank each of the witnesses for testifying today and for being here. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this agency implementation, how we can improve the management of federal IT. And I want to thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. And now I'd like to recognize Mr. Meadows, Chairman of the Subcommittee on Government Operations, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for being here. Mr. Chairman, I want to just thank you for taking a topic that, as you mentioned, back home in Texas may not have been the #1 topic for people to talk about. But I can tell you, in terms of making real impact, this particular issue, under your leadership and that of Ms. Kelly, will truly transform how we do business. You know, just in the last few days, we've heard of all kinds of taxpayer information, employees, 4 million employees. When we start to think about the cyber attacks, that goes hand in glove with some of our IT acquisitions. And so I look forward to working with you and the ranking member, certainly with OMB, as you work to try to streamline what we're doing and make it more efficient. The GAO, y'all have done some great work. I've read a lot of your work as it identifies this. And Mr. Spires, I understand you have a background with the IRS, and I was troubled to hear the other day that they still have aspects of their IT that has either COBOL or Fortran programming. Now, I shared that with some of the people in my office, and I said, to give you an idea, those languages are older than you are, and so they were languages that I was learning when I was in college. And so just the maintenance of those kinds of languages and where we've come today, it's unbelievable that we would still be holding on to our security blanket. And indeed, when we do that, you know, we don't want to get rid of the old system because everybody's familiar with it and it's too much trouble to bring in the new system. You guys have heard it all. And yet what we find is the attackers. The one thing that may have saved us on some of those systems is the language is so old they can't figure it out. But in doing that, we've got to make a real investment. The chairman mentioned $80 billion. Well, really, we know that it's actually higher than that. And when you look at those offline IT acquisitions that are in some of those areas that we do not actually openly debate, we know that the figure could be well in excess of $100 billion. And so as we start to look at this, it is critical from not only from an accountability standpoint, but from a procurement standpoint, that we actually address this in a real way. And so my compliment to all of those that have been leading the way, but I look forward to serving in a great way under the leadership of you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member as we move forward. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for taking me back to my youth when we talked about cobalt as something that was super old, even when I was a youngster studying computer science at Texas A&M University. We're going to recognize Mr. Connolly when he arrives for an opening statement, but you know, we're going to also hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who would like to submit a written statement. And we will now recognize our panel of witnesses. I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Tony Scott, U.S. Chief Information Officer of the Office of E-Government and Information Technology at the Office of Management and Budget. As I said earlier, you have your hands full, sir, and I know you've been working hard in these 4 months that you've been on the job. The Honorable Ann Rung, Administrator for the Office of Federal Procurement Policy at the Office of Management and Budget as well. Thank you for being here, Ms. Rung. Dr. David Powner, Director of IT Management Issues at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, and Richard Spires, CEO of Resilient Network Systems and former Chief Information Officer at the IRS and Department of Homeland Security. Welcome to you all. And thank you for being here. And pursuant to community rules, all witnesses will be sworn before they testify. Please rise and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Please be seated. And let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be part of the record. And again, I think our first testimony is going to be Ms. Rung.
Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Kelly, Chairman Meadows, and Ranking Member Connolly, and members of the subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss how the acquisition and information technology communities are working together to implement FITARA to drive greater IT performance. As the Administrator for Federal Procurement Policy, I appreciate how FITARA will help address some of the complexity of the federal acquisition system, which often leads to ineffective and inefficient use of taxpayer funds, especially in IT contracting. In December 2014, I established a blueprint to simplify the acquisition system that I believe will help advance some of FITARA's key provisions, such as those calling for maximizing the benefit of strategic sourcing, developing government-wide software licenses, and expanding workforce training and the use of IT cadres. Today, I would like to take this opportunity to briefly highlight some of the work that the Office of Federal Procurement Policy is doing to implement FITARA in partnership with Federal CIO Tony Scott and the federal IT and acquisition community. First, FITARA calls for GSA to establish an enterprise-wide software program on behalf of civilian agencies to reduce lifecycle cost and improve asset management practices. To implement this section, Tony Scott and I chartered the enterprise-wide software category team to serve as lead for IT software. The team includes representatives from the Office of Management and Budget, GSA, and the Department of Defense. The team is tasked with developing and implementing a strategic plan to increase the number of enterprise license agreements, recommend policy changes to OMB to improve the acquisition and management of software, and monitor agency progress. We will then use the existing portfolio stat process to hold agencies accountable for moving to these shared solutions as appropriate. Also, a FITARA provision directs the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council to implement a preference in the Federal Acquisition Regulation for strategically sourced vehicles. The FAR Council has opened this case and will issue a rule for public comment later this summer. Such a preference will help OFPP raise the visibility of these solutions, promote their use, and better leverage the government's buying power. This rule will complement other strategies that OFPP is developing around category management to better manage our spend and improve results for the taxpayer. Category management is an approach taken from the private sector, which manages entire categories. General Services Administration have mapped the more than $275 billion of common spend into 10 super categories, including IT. While we're moving forward aggressively to collect and share information across all 10 categories, we're beginning with our deepest dive in IT. By managing IT as a category, driving government-wide strategies like moving to a single software license for certain areas will address many of the issues of duplications and inefficiencies raised by GAO and this committee. Finally, as FITARA recognizes, building the skills of our acquisition workforce is the single most important way to ensure that the government gets what it needs on time and on budget. Working with OMB's Office of E-Government and Information Technology, the U.S. Digital Services Team, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy, we have taken steps in the last year to drive greater IT expertise in our IT acquisition workforce. There is no doubt that FITARA will help me and my colleagues drive greater efficiencies and effectiveness in IT acquisitions in support of agency mission performances. I want to thank you for your thoughtfulness, vision, and hard work to make this happen. This work is incredibly complex and requires commitment from the most senior agency officials to the newest members of our acquisition and technology teams, and FITARA has really helped to catalyze our efforts. Tony Scott and I will continue to work together with our respective councils to strengthen and reinforce our efforts to reduce the cost and increase the value of our IT acquisitions. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Rung, and again, thanks for being here. Mr. Scott, over to you for 5 minutes.
Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Kelly, Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Connolly, and members of the subcommittees. Thank you for your bipartisan work in passing the first major overhaul of federal information technology in almost 20 years. Overseeing government-wide implementation of FITARA is one of my top priorities. FITARA, as you know, strengthens key IT reform initiatives to improve efficiency, effectiveness, and security of federal agency programs and operations by codifying portfolio stat, tech stat, and our data center initiatives. Since 2012, the federal government has achieved over $3 billion in cost savings and avoidance and countless other improvements as a result of these reform efforts. But despite these successes, major changes are needed to achieve the full potential of IT in the federal government. I learned in the private sector that a strong foundation of visibility into IT spending, partnerships with program leaders, and a solid understanding of IT's critical role in achieving mission outcomes is crucial for effectively managing technology in any enterprise. A core part of my team's work will be to build this new foundation by implementing FITARA in a way that's workable and consistent. And today I'm pleased to tell you that we've released our FITARA implementation guidance. I would like to provide you with a brief overview of the development process, key components, and implementation plans related to our guidance. First, our FITARA guidance is the result of extensive outreach and collaboration conducted over the past several months, mirroring the collaborative process used to develop the law itself. My team and I met multiple times with a diverse set of public and private sector stakeholders, and also provided for general public feedback to bring transparency to federal policymaking and to reach a broad audience. Our guidance takes major steps in ensuring CIOs have a seat at the table for technology-related budget, procurement, and workforce matters. And the backbone of our guidance is the common baseline, which outlines roles and responsibilities for CIOs and other senior agency officials. More importantly, it establishes a groundwork for productive partnerships among these leaders to make IT decisions that best support missions. And finally, it positions CIOs so they can be held accountable for how effectively they manage the full life cycle of IT-related products, services, and customer and citizens' outcomes, and achieve efficient, effective, and secure programs and operations. Because agencies operate in unique environments, our guidance provides for a CIO assignment plan to give agency CIOs the flexibility to meet the baseline in a manner that's tailored to their organization. This allows CIOs to designate other officials to act as their representative in aspects of the common baseline in a rules-based manner, if approved by OMB. The common baseline and the CIO assignment plan allow CIOs to retain oversight and accountability while minimizing bottlenecks. And as discussed in the guidance, we will utilize portfolio stat processes to hold agencies accountable for their implementation of our FITARA guidance. This guidance also details a number of other important components, such as tools to enhance security, accountability, data center optimization, and our federal technology procurement process. I'm certain that our guidance will have significant positive effects throughout government, including helping to address issues called out by GAO over the years, and most recently GAO's high-risk list entry regarding improving the management of information technology acquisitions and operations. In addition to portfolio stat sessions, OMB, through its policy and oversight role, is committed to working with agencies in their implementation of this guidance by, number one, evaluating agency self-assessment and implementation plans, number two, requiring agencies to post their approved plans publicly, enabling consistent OMB legislative and public oversight, and third, by engaging with the President's Management Council, the CIO Council, and the FITARA Executive Working Group to facilitate implementation and knowledge sharing. I also look forward to working with Congress to ensure consistent oversight and implementation of our guidance in the law. I thank the subcommittees for holding this hearing and for your commitment to ensuring successful implementation of FITARA. I'd be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Mr. Pountner, 5 minutes.
Chairman Hurd, Meadows, Ranking Members Kelly and Connolly, and members of the subcommittees, we appreciate the opportunity to testify this afternoon on our recent addition of IT acquisitions and operations to GAO's high-risk list. The federal government has wasted billions of dollars over the years on failed IT acquisitions. In addition to these acquisition challenges, operational systems are fraught with duplication and inefficiencies. I'd like to thank this committee for its excellent work and persistence on getting FITARA passed. If implemented effectively by OMB and the agencies, FITARA will greatly improve IT acquisitions and operations. However, strong congressional oversight is needed to make this happen. This afternoon, I'd like to discuss 5 specific areas that need to be addressed, starting with 2 that are associated with operational systems. As my written statement shows, we spend nearly 75% of the IT dollars on operational or legacy systems, leaving far too little to modernize the federal government. So we need to find ways to shift these dollars towards acquiring new technologies to further mission performance. The first is data center consolidation, where there is at least $7.5 billion on the table. Agencies to date have made solid progress, closing over 1,200 of the 9,700 centers and saving about $2 billion. The plan is to close an additional 2,600 centers and save an additional $5.5 billion. We think these savings can be higher because when we last looked at this, we saw good progress from agencies like DOD, DHS, and Treasury, but 6 agencies reported significant closures without much in associated savings, and we recommended that they take a look at this. These agencies are GSA, HHS, Interior, Justice, Labor, and NASA. FITARA requires agencies to report on these cost savings annually, and this should be a major oversight area for the Congress. The second area is portfolio stat, an excellent initiative to eliminate duplicative systems. The federal government has hundreds of financial management and human resource systems, for example, where $2 to $3 billion are spent annually in each of these areas. Agencies initially identified over 200 initiatives to eliminate duplication, and the plan was to save $6 billion. In April, we reported that planned savings were down from this original estimate and that the estimates were inconsistent with congressional reporting and did not follow OMB guidance. OMB needs to ensure that portfolio stat savings are complete, especially since FITARA requires congressional reporting on this. Now turning to systems acquisitions. Too often we hear of failed projects like DOD's ECSS project where $1 billion was wasted. There are 3 major areas where improvements would greatly help the federal government's delivery track record. These are better planning, transparency, and oversight. Starting with planning. Agencies need to go small and take an incremental approach to systems delivery. OMB's policy of requiring major investments to deliver in 6 months is simply not enforced consistently, and less than half of the IT acquisitions are planning to deliver within 6 months. FITARA requires that CIOs certify that IT investments are using this incremental approach. Again, congressional oversight in this area is also needed to ensure that the incremental certification does occur. Transparency. Of the 700 major investments reported on the IT dashboard, about 180, or roughly 1/4, are designated as moderate or high risk. These 180 projects total about $9 billion. Many agencies have accurate information on the dashboard and use that information to tackle troubled projects. For example, HHS, DHS, Commerce, Interior acknowledge that many projects and dollars are at risk, and we believe this is a good sign so that appropriate attention can be given to these risky projects. Others do not have accurate information on the dashboard. In addition to questioning CIOs on the accuracy of these ratings, this committee also needs to push OMB to make these ratings available throughout the year. Again, this year the dashboard ratings were frozen from August 2015 through March during budget deliberations. This simply needs to stop so that there is constant investment transparency. We learned this week that OMB has plans to address this. The final area is oversight. OMB and agencies need to hold executive governance reviews of troubled projects so that course correction can occur. And when needed, poorly performing projects need to be stopped, and those in charge need to be held accountable. These occurred frequently right after the dashboard went live with OMB's TechStat sessions with great results. Several underperforming projects were corrected, de-scoped, and several were even halted. In summary, by tackling duplicative IT systems and consolidating data centers, upwards of $10 billion can be saved. And on acquisitions, agencies need to go small, be more transparent on project status, and aggressively oversee the projects at risk. This concludes my statement. I'll be pleased to answer questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Spires, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Hurd and Meadows, Ranking Members Carley and Conley, and members of the subcommittees. I'm honored to testify today, and I wish to acknowledge Representative Connolly's leadership in sponsoring FITARA. Since I served as the CIO of the IRS and later DHS, I hope my in-the-trenches experience is of value to help guide FITARA implementation. Earlier this year, GAO placed improving the management of IT acquisitions and operations on its high-risk list. For decades, the government has been underperforming in its delivery of major IT programs. Deeply embedded cultural and skills issues must be addressed if we are to improve the government's delivery of IT. This is where FITARA can make a significant positive difference if implemented effectively. GAO has identified 9 critical factors underlying successful major IT acquisitions. Yet, how does an agency ensure these factors are top of mind and implemented for all IT acquisitions? My experience from participating in and reviewing hundreds of programs leads to 2 foundational areas of focus critical to success. The first area of focus is the program governance model, which should ensure a collaborative partnership between various stakeholder organizations that have key roles in the IT acquisition. Even the best program manager fails if the program governance model does not work. The second area of focus involves the program management organization, PMO, having the requisite skills and proper representation from various stakeholders to operate effectively. All members of the PMO must be aligned and incentivized to work toward a common set of outcome-based success measures. FITARA must enable agency CIOs to ensure proper program governance and PMO models are in place for all significant IT acquisitions. I note that it is not the agency CIO that has the last say regarding major program decisions, but rather that the governance process is working effectively to ensure major decisions are made with all appropriate stakeholder input. For FITARA to be successful, it is critical that the initial rollout within agencies be effective. I'm very pleased to see the approach OMB and the new federal CIO, Tony Scott, are taking to support this rollout. OMB recently issued draft FITARA implementation guidance based on seeking significant outside input. This will improve content, understanding, and buy-in over the longer term. Yet there's a wide disparity in the maturity level of IT organizations across the agencies. A number of agencies will struggle with both the what and how to implement FITARA. To support this implementation effort, the American Council for Technology and Industry Advisory Council, IACT, a nonprofit organization, is forming a working group to support the development of tools that can provide agencies help to implement FITARA. The working group intent is to draw from the best of both the public and private sector's models for managing IT. The group will focus on providing a range of proven implementation models for budget formulation and oversight, program governance, and delegation of authorities that should cover the array of different agency models, from centralized to highly federated management of IT. Mr. Darren Ash, CIO of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, will serve as the government lead, and I will serve as the industry lead for this effort. Even with a solid FITARA implementation plan, success will be dependent on 2 additional factors. First, the agency CIO needs to have the leadership, management, and political experience to drive this change, as well as a deep understanding of IT management. And second, the agency leadership must be supportive of the agency CIO, particularly in agencies that are operating in a federated environment. Congress, through these subcommittees, can support these efforts by demanding aggressive implementation of FITARA by agencies, development of measures for assessing FITARA's impact, and transparency and reporting of ongoing progress. The benefits of FITARA implementation will take years to realize, so we will need to have persistence and patience. Implementation of this level of change takes 2 to 3 years, and benefits of that change being felt in year 3 and beyond. Regarding how to measure FITARA success, I would start with the metrics GAO has spelled out regarding what is required to remove IT acquisition from their high-risk list. To these metrics, I would add agency-specific measures of how IT can more effectively support the mission and business outcomes of the agency. This current administration has a golden opportunity to set the correct foundation for implementing FITARA so that when the next administration arrives, the critical element of FITARA are already taking root. And while I'm pleased with the work to date, it is critical to make enough progress during the next 18 months to ensure that leadership commitment to FITARA is sustained into the next Congress and administration. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spires. You can't have a conversation on FITARA without comments from the distinguished gentleman from Virginia. I'd like to recognize Mr. Connolly for 5 minutes for opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being so gracious. I want to thank you and the committee for holding today's important hearing to examine the implementation of the bipartisan FITARA Act, or as we often prefer up here, ISA Connolly. FITARA is the first major reform of the laws governing federal IT management and procurement since the enactment of the seminal Clinger-Cohen Act of 1996. And I want to take a moment to recognize the leadership of our former colleagues, Bill Clinger and Senator William Cohen. Today, there's widespread agreement that the text of the Clinger-Cohen Act was quite good and that the 1996 law held the potential to be truly transformative. However, in retrospect, it is clear that the Clinger-Cohen Act, while establishing a solid statutory framework, unfortunately fell short of achieving its full potential. There's also consensus that the primary weakness of that act was not the bill itself, but actually its inadequate implementation, which was exacerbated by the absence of congressional oversight at that time, the latter being an unfortunate result in part of both offers departing Congress shortly after the law's enactment. That's why today's oversight hearing, Mr. Chairman, is so important to change that pattern of history. With the history of Clinger-Cohen in mind, and as the co-author of FITARA, I'm committed to doing everything in our part to guarantee that we do not repeat the implementation mistakes of the past. And I'm so delighted that my colleague in arms, Mr. Meadows, shares that commitment. I know Ms. Kelly does, and I know you do, Mr. Chairman, and that's great. And I know Mr. Issa has not lost interest in this either, though he's now in Judiciary Committee making music over there. We have to make sure that the FITARA implementation is not Clinger-Cohen 2.0. Congress must and will diligently monitor its implementation and won't accept unnecessary delays, improper half measures, and the stubborn preservation of the status quo. The good news here, though, is that the administration is on our same page. And I'm so pleased that FITARA implementation has gotten off to a tremendous start, in no small part due to the efforts of the 4 people in front of us. I want to commend the leadership, particularly of the Office of Management and Budget, because, including our excellent witnesses today, in many respects, the FITARA guidance that they've issued is one of the best policy publications I've ever seen. It's enthusiastic, it's clear, and it is with the program. We're not fighting at all. From its content to the collaborative nature in which it was developed to the innovative and transparent manner in which it was published, OMB's efforts to implement FITARA truly represent a best practice and new milestone in good government. And I'm so pleased that since FITARA's enactment, the administration has demonstrated full recognition of the importance of effective implementation. As OMB noted in its proposed guidance, quote, FITARA is a historic law that represents the first major overhaul of federal information technology IT in almost 20 years, unquote. I'm also pleased that GAO recognizes the potential to achieve billions of dollars in cost savings and cost avoidances by strengthening agency CIO authorities and promoting the elimination of wasteful and duplicative IT systems. At a February 2015 hearing held by our committee, the Honorable Gene Dodaro, the Comptroller General, explained GAO's rationale behind designating improving the management of IT acquisitions and operations as a new government-wide high-risk area, stating, and I quote, "One of the reasons we put IT acquisitions and operations on the list is in order to elevate attention to make sure that FITARA," and he says, Isa Connolly, "is implemented effectively." God bless Gene Dodaro. Moving forward, there's bipartisan bicameral support for fully implementing FITARA. The vast majority of members, I think, share the goal of dramatically curbing wasteful IT spending on antiquated IT systems and want to promote management practices that will prevent agencies from wasting billions of taxpayer dollars on IT boondoggles that fall years behind schedule and pair staggeringly poor performance with shockingly high costs. There's also a recognition that federal policymakers and agency administrators must cease relegating IT management to the cellar of an agency's organizational hierarchy. The bottom line is that FITARA's enactment represents a long overdue recognition that in the 21st century, effective governance is inextricably linked with how well government leverages technology. This reality of modern government underscores why it's incumbent upon both branches of government to work together in a pragmatic fashion to ensure we take advantage of the opportunities this legislation, I believe, affords us. So in closing, Mr. Chairman, I want to take a moment again to express my sincere gratitude and appreciation to the leadership of this committee and our subcommittees, and to OMB and GAO, especially in elevating the importance of this issue and the implementation of FITARA. Thank you, and I look forward to having a chance to dialogue with the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. And now it's a pleasure to recognize my colleague from North Carolina, Chairman Meadows, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for your opening statements. I will apologize up front. I actually have another meeting I was supposed to be at 15 minutes ago, so the chairman was kind enough to let me go ahead with some of my questions. So, Ms. Rung, let me start with you. With regards to these legacy systems that are out there, a lot has been talked about in terms of where they are, how much we're spending. How can we, from a procurement standpoint, allow a redo or a start over? We've got FITARA, we've got a number of these others, but it's all in the implementation, as my good friend Mr. Connolly just outlined. What can we do to make sure that we are not sitting here 2 years from now with the same problem?
Thank you for the question. As my colleagues stated, IT acquisition spend is approximately $80 billion a year, so this is an important space for us to tackle. And I appreciate GAO's work in this area, and in particular in putting it on the high-risk list, because it lends a energy and focus to some of our efforts to really address this area. When I think about IT acquisitions, I really think of it in two buckets. Really, there's the IT systems, which is a much different strategy in tackling that area. And I also think of IT commodities, where we're really focused on how can we be more efficient. In the IT systems area, what I hear consistently from industry is that the issues and challenges start at the requirements phase, right? Really early in the process. And a couple things we're doing in this space, I think it all comes down to the acquisition and IT workforce, and do they have the skills and training to know how to put these acquisitions together. We're developing for the first time a specialized IT acquisition team. When I started in this job, I sat down with our former CTO, Todd Park, who talked about the success of the digital services team, but these are primarily technologists from Silicon Valley. He stated that we should be thinking about the acquisition equivalent of this. From that point on, we started to collaborate, along with my colleague Tony Scott, the federal CIO, on creating a first certified digital IT acquisition team. We're going to start by pulling career employees, career contracting officers from the agencies. We're going to put them through a training we're developing in partnership with industry, and we're going to send them back to the agencies early next year to really provide a hands-on approach in developing these acquisitions and thinking about, can we write these requirements in a more agile way? To be more specific, oftentimes I hear from industry that our requirements or statements of work are several hundred pages long and overly government oriented and overly prescriptive. And then they are required to submit proposals that are several hundred pages long. What we'd like to move to through this new team is thinking about more succinct statement of objectives, thinking about having industry submit short concept papers, and really trying to approach these acquisitions in a more modular manner. And I think that will have a significant impact in the IT system space.
All right, so let's assume that we do that, and we take that and we break it down. Is there not a danger of looking at the old way that we've done acquisitions, whether it's procurement or getting rid of the systems that we've had, that we run home again to that safety blanket and say, well, we're willing to come halfway. You know, instead of it being a 100-page RFP, it's an 80-page. How do we make it more results-driven? As a business guy, you know, all I want it to do is perform a particular function and do it as effectively as we can, and yet we somehow seem to continue to run back to Fortran and COBOL kind of systems to keep them running.
No, it's a great question. How do you have an impact in such a large, complex space that represents overall $450 billion in spending, where I have 3,300 different contracting offices across the globe? So how do you really make an impact and try to drive change? I think FITARA represents a major transformation in how we think about IT acquisitions. The way I'm approaching it is thinking about our efforts like a startup company, and I'm focusing on a small team of people. I know that the first time that I developed this program to create a new specialized team or a new specialized IT cadre, I may not get it exactly right. I want to put them through this training that we're developing in partnership with industry. I want to send them back to the agencies to provide that hands-on assistance. But most likely I'm going to tweak that, and I want to scale it up over time. And I think what the digital service team has shown is that a small group of people can have a huge impact in this area.
I see I'm out of time, so I'm going to yield back to the chairman, but I would like the GAO, if you can let us know how we can help. You mentioned oversight being the critical component, how we can know whether we're making progress or not, a matrix, you know, best performers, worst performers, whatever we can do, if you would do that, and I won't ask you to respond to that, but I'll yield back to the chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to recognize my friend and ranking member, Ms. Kelly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. OMB's guidance will help agencies establish effective oversight of the management of their IT investments and resources. Mr. Scott, what is the desired outcome of the enhancements to agency oversight of IT resources? What benefits can be anticipated?
I think there's a number of what I'd call success factors that we should look to over time as FITARA and the other things that we're doing get implemented. The first one, I think, is faster delivery of needed capability. In this world, speed of delivery is everything. As probably obvious, in most cases when you do things faster, you're limited in the amount of money you can spend doing it, and so there's a double benefit. The second thing I would say is efficiency of spend, and there are a number of different ways that we can measure that. I would then look to being on time and on budget as a classic measure. I don't think that goes away. We also have to make sure that the systems we deliver and the capabilities and infrastructure that we deliver are secure, and there's ways that we will measure that. And then I think we have to look at the underlying components, our infrastructure and delivery capability, and make sure that's also modern. I think measures in each of those areas are the things that I would look for.
Let's speak a little bit about transparency. The guidance also provides for increased transparency and accountability of agency management of IT resources. So what are some examples of increased transparency regarding IT acquisitions and operations, and how will increased transparency contribute to effective congressional oversight?
Well, the first thing you'll notice is in August of this year, each of the agencies will be required to submit their self-assessment plan and their plan for FITARA implementation. And that'll be made public, and certainly we'll be all over it, and I'm sure this committee will also be looking at it along with GAO and others. That's the first in a set of reports and deliverables that come out of FITARA. And in addition, we're going to keep doing the portfolio stat and tech stat and cyber stat reviews that we do. And as was already mentioned, we have improvements underway to the IT dashboard as well. So I think all of those will help both with the timeliness, but also the visibility and transparency of how this goes.
You said you're sure this committee will be all over it, but why do you think the GAO believes congressional oversight is so essential?
Well, I think in this particular case, as there's a huge amount of transformation taking place in the IT industry and every business, government, and institution, getting this right is table stakes for all interests. And I think given the various roles that the parties that you mentioned play, it's important that we have each of those perspectives in on this and that it's shared broadly across the community of interests.
My colleague, Ranking Member Connolly, a co-author of this legislation, has repeatedly expressed the need for congressional oversight of the implementation of FITARA to help ensure the improvement it directs are achieved in government-wide. Mr. Powner, what is at risk if congressional oversight is not maintained on agency implementation?
Well, Ranking Member Kelly, I think if you look at the history, and it was mentioned here going back to Klinger-Cohen, the history of implementing effectively, going back to Klinger-Cohen, OMB's recent initiatives, our high-risk area, and a lot of FITARA is OMB's own initiatives that haven't been implemented to completion. That's the bottom line. And history tells us that if you leave it up to the administration, OMB and the agencies, it doesn't work as well. But if you have Congress overseeing key areas to ensure that there's cost savings, a good area is incremental development. We all agree that we ought to go smaller to help with the delivery. If we got real serious about incremental development and implemented OMB's 6-month policy, maybe we shouldn't fund projects either from an appropriation perspective or from OMB's perspective that they can't deliver within the budget year. Let's look real hard at not funding those projects. They should deliver something within the budget year.
Mr. Scott, do you agree?
I think many projects lend themselves to that kind of short incremental development. But I would say we have to be a little bit careful there. And I'm not trying to, put a wet blanket on any of this. I think there's much more opportunity for us to do that than others. And so I strongly endorse that trend. But I think one of the challenges that I see already is there's already a funding sort of quagmire in the way some projects are managed. And one of the things that I do know greatly impacts the success of a project is if there's a lot of start, stop, that leads to a ton of inefficiency and so on. So I'd prefer to see a mechanism that, if the programs are meeting its goals and its deadline, there's not uncertainty about funding, and if there's problems, then you yank the cord.
I've run out of time, so thank you, but I look forward to working with the members of this committee to provide effective oversight of the implementation of I never can say this right, FITARA reforms to help ensure that needed improvements are achieved. So thank you all very much.
Mr. Walberg, 5 minutes is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Powner, CIO integration into the IT investment decision-making process, as we've discussed here, is key to successful implementation of FITARA. How do we ensure that the CIO is actually integrated into the IT investment decision and the process associated with that within each agency and department?
Yeah, I think that's the key question. When you look at FITARA, that's the first provision and probably the most important, is enhancing the CIO authorities. I think OMB deserves a lot of credit for their common baseline and what they're attempting to do to elevate the CIO authorities within each agency. ensuring that they're part of the budget approval and execution process. But you're absolutely right, and as Mr. Spires mentioned in his statement, there's some agencies that are going to really struggle with that because of their current setup. The way they're currently set up, they don't necessarily have that budget, that oversight of the budget approval and the execution, have the appropriate governance processes that Richard referred to. So that's the challenge. That is the challenge. So first of all, you need the appropriate processes, but we also need the appropriate people. And I think one of the things, hopefully with FITARA, it's going to attract even a better breed of CIOs into the federal government if, in fact, it's a real CIO job. Some of the CIO jobs in the federal government aren't CIO jobs that you have in the private.
So it's not encouraging.
Well, it can get a lot better, and clearly we have pockets of success. There are pockets of success that we can learn from where there are the appropriate authorities, and I think with the common baseline, it's a step in the right direction, but it's going to take time. And I think, again, your congressional oversight, when you look at these plans to fill the gaps that agencies have on the common baseline, that's going to be really important that we implement that effectively.
Mr. Scott, before I go to Mr. Spires to respond to that and add to it, Mr. Scott, responding to what Mr. Pounder just ended his statement with, carry on with that thought.
Well, I totally agree. This is all about, having capable and competent people. And I've added it as one of the priorities for my team in terms of things that we're spending a lot of time on. So it's looking at talent across the federal government, making sure that there's good development experiences for the talented people that are working in these roles, that they get exposed to multiple kinds of organizations and the broad set of things that are required of a CIO in a big organization. I think that's an important part of our responsibility as leaders to make sure that when we're gone, the next generation of leadership is in place and has the right skill sets to do the jobs that we're asking of them.
And the expectations on them and accountability as well.
That's right.
Yeah. Mr. Spires.
Yeah, I certainly would echo the thoughts about the importance of having the skill sets. I would pick up on this idea of having the proper support. It's critical that the CIOs are empowered to be able to do what they need to do within these agencies, and particularly in those agencies that have federated environments where there's not just one single CIO organization or IT organization. And I think that's going to be incumbent upon OMB and the administration to make sure that that happens and that the support is there from the agency leadership to enable that CIO to be effective, because they're going to be dealing in a federated environment with bureau CIOs or other heads of IT and other organizations in that agency, and that all has to work collectively to be able to carry out FITARA in a distributed kind of manner. And the good news is that OMB's done a nice job with their guidance of laying out ways in which you can set that model up. But there are proven models to be able to work in that federated environment. So it's also going to be incumbent upon OMB to make sure that those agency models fit the agency well. And they've got a process for that review. I don't know if every agency is going to get it right the first time, but I think as there's an iterative process and a real drive to make this happen, over the next 18 months, you should be able to get these models to work well.
Ms. Rung, tie the bow on this discussion here from your perspective, especially dealing with policy. Policy and personnel sometimes run amok. Help us in answering here.
Well, to build upon what Mr. Spires talked about a little bit of the challenges of the federated system, what I've seen is the impact of that on the acquisition space. And without the CIOs really having accountability and authority, what I've seen in the acquisition space is that there are not owners of certain IT commodities. For example, mobile devices. No one in the agency feels accountability for the mobile devices, so you see lots of duplication and a lack of transparency. With reference to the workforce and ensuring, we are, focusing on the skills of our workforce, I echo everything that was said here. I think I approach it in two different ways. I mean, one, we want to make sure that we're holding our acquisition personnel accountable for performance. At the same time, I want to ensure we're lifting up and helping to train and strengthen our workforce and really recognize the good work that is going on across government.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you, sir. Now I'd like to recognize Mr. Connolly for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but could I just ask, if there were colleagues ahead of me before I arrived, I would certainly defer to them.
I'd like to recognize Ms. Holmes Norton for 5 minutes then.
Thank you. I want to be fair.
Well, my good friend from Virginia is always fair, and I certainly appreciate it. I went straight to the GAO report because I am particularly interested in diagnosis. We have we have the bill, and we're beginning its implementation. The part I went to page 2 in particular. We hear a great deal about IT failures. We hear about them in the public sector. We hear about them more often in the private sector. It leads me to believe that IT itself should be seen as still a developing science, or why there's so many failures, even from people who lose tremendously at the bottom line. So I'm interested, Mr. Powner, in page 2 of the GAO report, because the only thing worse than taking a long time to acquire or taking a long time for a system to come online is taking a long time and then the whole thing fails. You spent billions of dollars down the drain. So on page 2, you list some very costly examples. Just to touch on a few, after 5 years, DOD had to just cancel its combat support system, or I won't list them all. 9 years. The VA scheduling and replacement project. Then finally they just, called it quits. But that's 9 years worth of money. 16 years. They sure do stick with them a long time. This is the tri-agency weather satellite programs. There are a number of agencies in on this one. $5 billion in 16 years. Now, so my first question is this kind of failure typical of large-scale operations? Or should we look in the public and private sector? I mean, is this simply IT finding its way in truly large-scale systems? Because we see large-scale systems in the private sector going overboard, too, with far worse consequences. So first I want to know what's wrong, or are we in such a developmental stage that somehow these agencies feel they ought to stick with these things? I mean, we're in for a dime, we're in for a dollar, we're in until somebody throws us out. And why don't they get out sooner? Why do they spend the last dollar before they decide this just isn't working? And what can we do about it? Will FITARA do anything about it?
Yeah, there's aspects of FITARA that would help greatly. So first of all, again, I'll emphasize the incremental certification by the CIOs of major IT systems. I agree with Mr. Scott's comment. Some of them you can't go real small, but you can do it with a lot more. Best practices, we've done a lot of best practices work on successful acquisitions. These are failures, and I can tell you about each one of them, but the successful ones, they typically all go small. The other thing is, I'm going to reemphasize the TechStat process that OMB implemented right after the dashboard went live. There were about 50-some projects, 70-some meetings, and there were a lot of these projects that were halted, de-scoped, corrected, and there was great progress to the tune that OMB says $3 billion were saved. We need to go back to looking at these projects, because within agencies, there's a reluctance to stop a project. I have a report coming out next week on a Department of Agriculture project. It's listed back in my testimony as something to look. You could add it to the failed list right
So
now.
what's the reluctance? What's the reason for the reluctance?
The reluctance is to not acknowledge that we have these problems and to think that we can fix them.
Will the CIO help that?
The CIO should help with that. And I think sometimes not just terminating or canceling, but sometimes we can de-scope and have course correction on them. That's where these tech stat meetings with the right governance models can really help. And so we saw it right after the dashboard went live with OMB's meetings. It was a successful time correcting a lot of these troubled projects.
I can't help but ask you, when we just had this $4 million employee breach at the OPM, we've had one of those you list is a little less costly, was the retirement system, and that's been one of the OPM retirement system. That's been one that's been before this committee over and over again as a failure. To what do you ascribe what happened to the OPM?
With the retirement systems, I looked at that years ago.
The retirement system and the collapse reported last.
There's been multiple starts and stops on that retirement system at OPM. I think we try to do too much. Why don't you start with a really simple retirement, a very simple employee, stayed at one agency, and you start small and you deliver. I know when Mr. Spires was at IRS, he finally did process tax returns on a modern platform. You know what he did? He took a 1040EZ and did it. He went small and simple, and then they grew it. And everyone at IRS said, look, wow, we're now processing on a modern platform. No one really cared there was only a 1040EZ. We try to do everything with the retirement system replacement. Again, going small really would help. I don't want to simplify this too much, but that would be a huge step in the right direction.
Yeah, we sure do pilots on a lot of things. Why not on this? Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Actually, I want to pick up on that topic. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. And maybe Ms. Rung or Mr. Scott, this is appropriately directed to you. How do we hold people accountable for this stuff, right? When people that are consistently on this high-risk report, right? When we had a conversation, a hearing on this topic earlier this year, I asked Gene Dodaro, had anybody ever been fired for a cost overrun and time overrun? And he said he couldn't remember that. And so, the question is it the procurement officers? Is it the line management officers? On IT projects, does FITARA give the CIO enough power and authority in order to bring to bear some real consequences if these type of projects continue to go? And Mr. Scott, I'll open that one to you.
Well, I think it does, and I think, but I would, let me answer the question by leading up to it a little bit. Many of these projects, the failed ones that I think are notorious, you could sort of look at in the beginning and say, what are the chances of this succeeding? And you could put a risk factor on that, and you'd say, not high, because it's too big, too complex, not organized the right way. There's a whole list of things that, you could probably criticize. And so I think that holding people accountable starts with what's the design, what's the intent of these things in the first place, and making sure that there's good engagement across the agency leadership, including the CIO, where everybody looking at it says, I think we've got a chance of this succeeding because we've got the right approach, we've chunked it up into the right increments of deliverables and so on.
But how do we, I think it was you, Ms. Rung, that mentioned up front that it's the requirements process. So if we're, the problem with procurement now is we're asking, describing the problem, and then sometimes in the procurement we're describing how the solution is supposed to be implemented, and even including specific technologies, which is eliminating a lot of folks, entrepreneurs, creativity, by also defining, the solution to the problem.
I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, my goal is to get to a point where we don't have to hold anyone accountable because the IT acquisition was a success, right? We want to fix and identify and fix these issues way before we get to the point where we're calling for heads to roll. And you are indeed correct that many of these problems start at the requirements phase, and I think it's quite literally training people in how to do these acquisitions in a much more agile way and how to write these acquisition requirements and providing that kind of hands-on assistance and getting to these acquisitions early.
Mr. Spires, question to you. What are going to be the barriers of implementation with FITARA? Are there going to be CIOs across the agencies that actually don't want this authority because it's going to change the way they do things, and they're going to actually have to do work now? How do you address, a reticent person from, actually having to do their job?
I'm not going to put it all on the CIOs. I think what we face is cultural issues within many of these agencies. Many of these organizations, and I don't want to just pick only on the federated ones, but clearly the federated ones face this, they're used to a certain level of autonomy, and particularly in a lot of these programs. So you'll have major programs that have a lot of IT, but the mission people don't view them as, quote, IT programs. And that's been an issue, because then you actually have situations where you're not using even close to best practice. You don't have the right kind of skill sets involved in oversighting these projects. I mean, we can bet what happens in those cases. So to me, what I like so much about FITARA and what I like about what OMB has done to date with the implementation guidance is this notion that, yes, we are going to empower the CIO, we're going to hold that individual accountable, and that individual within their organization is down the line going to have to make sure that these programs are set up for success. I've overseen a lot of programs, and I would echo what my colleagues just said from OMB. If you don't start right, you are almost doomed to failure. And I would much rather start and say, oh, got to stop right away because we don't have the right people on board, or we don't have the right acquisition strategy or the right procurement strategy. Let's get those things right out of the gate. Then the success can happen. I've seen it time and time again. And to Mr. Pownder's point, you got to start small, have small wins, and then build off of that.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, welcome to our panel. The Project on Government Oversight, POGO, is a nonpartisan independent watchdog organization, and it noted last month that FITARA is, and I quote, meant to strengthen the role of each agency CIO and executive responsible for all IT systems in the agency, as well as to increase transparency in how IT funds are spent. However, the Department of Energy's 17 national laboratories would apparently prefer that this oversight and accountability requirement not apply to them. The 2016 Senate Energy and Water Development Appropriations Bill actually includes an amendment that would exempt the Energy Department and national labs from key requirements of FITARA and the bill's predecessor, Klinger-Cohen. I wonder if you might comment on this whole issue of carve-outs, because I'm sure OMB has been getting some requests for carve-outs. We have here too. And my view is, gee, we haven't even learned how to walk yet. We're just getting to guidelines of implementation. It's awfully premature to be deciding we need to be carved out, unless maybe you've got something you're worried about. But I'd be interested in your professional opinion. What about this issue of carve-outs?
I'll start. So I appreciate the question. We are certainly anxious to talk to the agencies if they have concerns and work with them to address their concerns. OMB has formally stated that they find the proposal to carve out the Department of Energy labs highly problematic. And it's our viewpoint that FITARA is a tremendous management tool for the agencies, and we are not keen on carving out the Department of Energy labs.
Mr. Pounder, any view from GAO?
Yeah, this is not the time to carve out. If you look at OMB's guidance, I think there's some flexibility in how you set this up when you have federated organizations, and the labs are quite federated. But when you look at, what they're intending to do with that, that the CIO at DOE doesn't have the expertise, or FFRDC shouldn't be included, or R&D should not be included. If you step back and look at that, it probably should be included. R&D tied to IT should be under the CIO's authority. And when you really look at, we got to let this bake a while and not immediately start carving out.
Just a caution, what's happening is people wanting carve-outs are coming up here and seeking legislative redress before we've even implemented the bill that was just signed into law in December, and giving chutzpah a whole new dimension of meaning. At any rate, I think it's worthy of your note and ours as well. We need to resist that temptation, and because I agree, it was designed to be a useful management tool that can save you money and make you more efficient. It's not an adversarial bill, and let's give it some time to marinate. CIOs, and I'll address this to you, Mr. Scott, and you, Mr. Spires, particularly. There are 250 people roughly, or when we wrote the bill, 250 people with the title CIO spread out over 24 agencies. No private corporation would tolerate that. I don't care how big. When I go in my district and I meet with little and big companies, I kind of ask, how many CIOs have you got? And they all look at me like, well one, not the federal government. So we didn't mandate by fiat you can only have one, but we tried to create incentives to infuse one person with authority and accountability and flexibility in making decisions. I wonder, what is your take on that and how we ought to evolve? And Mr. Spires, you was one. And so I'd be interested particularly in your take on it.
Well, I've actually worked in an organization that had multiple CIOs that was, a fairly large enterprise. It wasn't 200, but there was more than one, in divisions and then corporate CIO and so on. And my response would be, I think you're on the right track. The important thing for us is to clearly define what the roles and responsibilities at the agency level are, and then what the authorities are that they can delegate to others, and whether their title is CIO or chief bottle washer or whatever it happens to be, make sure where those accountabilities lie.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Mr. Scott, and I would just add to that I don't think it's necessarily bad given how large some of these agencies are. I mean, like the one I was at, Homeland Security. It makes sense to have a federated model. You want an IT organization at a component level, as we called them, that really gets to understand the mission, needs, and understands that leadership team and works closely with them. I think where we've gone awry, though, is that many of those components, or bureaus at Treasury and the like, they view themselves as having to do it all. And what we need to do is move to a model where, particularly when it comes to the commodity or infrastructure IT elements, where we can leverage buying power of the federal government, we need to start to do much more of that and to really start to reduce duplication. That's the other big point, is we talk a lot about spending on legacy, but a lot of that is on systems, and when you start counting them up, and Mr. Powney here can comment on this, we have way too many systems overall, and the way to start to reduce those is through good governance, through strong leadership at the agency level that's driving that simplification, which not only saves us a lot of money, I think it makes, it makes you run much more effectively, and it makes you actually a lot more secure, which is also a really key issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now I'd like to recognize my colleague from Iowa, Mr. Blum, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. And thank you very much to the panel for being here today and sharing your expertise and your insights with us. I have a question for Mr. Powner. Since 2010, the GAO has made 737 IT-related recommendations. As of January, only 23% of those have been fully implemented. And I come from the private sector, and I am a career businessman. If this happened in my company, heads would roll. Can you tell me, A, what that number is today, and B, what, in your opinion, accounts for that delay?
Yeah, I don't have an exact update. It's slightly higher, but not much, just a few percentages. You're absolutely right. So here's the challenge. When we make recommendations, we give agencies about 4 years that we follow up on a 4-year basis fairly aggressively to see if those recommendations are indeed implemented. Those 700 and some recommendations do not include all of our information security, so that's just tied to IT management type things. So there's room for great improvement. One of the things we're doing, I know the Comptroller General, Gene Dodaro, we've prioritized those recommendations by agency, and most of the priority recs do include several of these IT areas where there's 10 to 15 recommendations going to the heads of departments and agencies to really highlight the importance of implementing those recommendations going forward. So again, you're absolutely right. It's a great challenge. We're trying to do our best. At times, you know, some of the congressional oversight, you guys can help us with that too, leaning on some of these agencies to be more focused on our recommendations. Hearings like this greatly help.
I mean, I'm almost afraid to ask this, but are these not being implemented because we're understaffed, or is it because the head of the agency doesn't view them as particularly important?
I think it's a combination of things. I think sometimes it's competing with priorities, no doubt, to be fair to some agencies, but also, too, I think there needs to be intense focus. Here's what happens. We go in and do a review, make recommendations. Many times you can go into that same agency 3 or 4 years later, and we make the same recommendations all over again. And so that's where we just need, again, more aggressive follow-up, and it needs to be more of a priority at some of these agencies.
Will FITARA help address these delays, in your opinion?
We greatly hope so. So as an example, I'll tell you this. Data center consolidation is a great initiative, and we've saved about $2 billion with data center consolidation to date. But there's a lot of agencies that think they're done. We have $5.5 billion that we can continue to save, but we need focus on our recommendations. I highlighted 6 agencies in my oral statement that, frankly, they had a lot of consolidations with very little associated savings, and we highlighted that and made those recommendations. So we're going to continue to drive forward on those recs.
Are there deadlines given like there would be in the private sector, given to resolve some of these recommendations that have been made, the 737?
Yeah, well,
do the department heads or agency heads give deadlines?
Department heads and agencies are required within several months to get back to us on our recommendations after we write a report. And then, you know, typically they're not implemented in that period of time. But again, then they are on the hook to report back to us on implementation. Again, we track them over a 4-year period. There are exceptions made typically by the Comptroller General that he will extend that 4-year period for very important recs.
Thank you. And my next question is to Mr. Scott, who was in the, or is in the private sector, currently, I believe, was in the private sector. If you could just comment, Mr. Scott, briefly about the difference. Is there a difference in finding qualified people for the private sector versus finding qualified people for the public sector?
I would say there's probably 2 issues that I would talk about in that space. Yes, it is difficult, both in the private sector and the public sector. The public sector has some additional hurdles associated with it, hiring authorities and so on, that I know this committee and others have addressed over a period of time.
Are any of those hurdles culture?
I'm sure there are some. I've only been here 4 months, so I'm not deeply steeped in the culture.
I've only been here 4 months as well.
Yeah, but I'm sure there are some of those as well. But I'll give you an example out of my private sector experience. We looked at hiring and our ability to get the best talent, and one of the things that we discovered was not what we were paying, not what the job was or anything else. It was the speed with which we could get an offer in somebody's hands. And so quite often the person we wanted would have taken a job with us, but because we were slow, ended up taking a job somewhere else. And so one of the things I'm looking at are what are the things that we can do to be quicker at, you know, getting a job offer in the hands of the person that we want.
Very good, thank you. I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And now it's a pleasure to recognize for 5 minutes my fellow computer scientist and colleague from the Golden State, Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Chairman Hurd. Thank you for calling this important hearing. Thank you, Representative Connolly, for your work on FITARA, and to the panel for your public service. 45 years ago, we sent a man to the moon and brought him back. So it's not as if our government can't contract with very complicated systems. But we also didn't launch if it was only 80% ready, right? We knew that thing was going to work. And it seems to me that for whatever reason in the public sector, I've noticed that the public sector will launch products they know are not ready. So the Affordable Care Act was a disaster at rollout. And there were people that knew it was not ready, and it launched. And it's working well now, and testing makes a huge difference. They just had to test on more people, figure out the bugs. I'm sure Chairman Hurd and I would agree that we've never seen a computer program work the first time. In Los Angeles, and it's not limited to federal government, Los Angeles County, LA Unified School District had a program that was just going to track students, figure out their classes and where they were going to go. And they knew it wasn't ready because the papers reported it wasn't ready, and they launched anyways. It's one reason the superintendent resigned. And you see this happening, and I'm just curious from your view, why is it that that happens? Because in the private sector, if Microsoft's about to launch a product and it's not ready, they don't launch. They push it back. They do more testing. They make sure when they launch it to the consumers, it doesn't crash the first time you use it. So I'm just curious, is it that CIOs are not trained adequately to know the thing doesn't work, or is it that agency heads are overriding them, or the CIO is not telling the agency head this thing isn't working? What is causing these launches of products that don't work the first time?
Mr. Liu, I will comment, having not been part of the Affordable Care Act launch, but having worked at a couple different agencies and seeing the dynamics at times within government agencies that FITARA really, I believe, should address. And that, I call it a breakdown in governance, okay, where you end up in a situation where the people that actually understand what it takes to launch these systems no longer have a say in what actually is launched, when it's launched, how it's launched. And I hate to say it, but I have seen this happen a couple times in government. And we need to make sure, and that's one of the paramount things about FITARA, is to empower the agency CIO. Now, you better have a competent agency CIO, right? But the agency CIO that understands IT management, that says, we're rushing this thing through testing to try to get it launched. We know that's going to fail, right? These are some basic things. If you build IT systems, you learn. Most of us have learned the hard way, I'm afraid. But these are things that you learn over time, and we need to make sure that that governance model is in place. It doesn't mean that the CIO has the ultimate say in everything, and that's the pushback you get. But that individual has a key seat at the table, so when those discussions are happening, that individual says, 80% chance this is going to fail if we do this. We have to find a different way. Those discussions have to happen.
Under FITARA, if the CIO believes that this system is not ready to go, can the agency still launch it?
Well, our guidance is that in the agencies, they do the tech stats, and they're to do monthly reports. So if a project is read for 3 months in a row, there's a mandatory tech stat review. OMB is invited to that, and we'd certainly have a discussion at that point about whether the program was on track and ready to launch. So I think that, regular review is one of the steps that you would look at. But I actually worked at Microsoft for about 5.5 years and saw success and failure in big IT projects and so on. And the phenomena that Mr. Spires talked about is exactly the problem. There's not the level of transparency. You get an attitude that you're too big to fail, that you just have to go ahead. The information that needs to get to leadership to make the right decision doesn't get there, and people, jump off the cliff and only then discover that there's a big problem. So I do think that FITARA helps us with visibility and transparency at a much more granular level that should help us avoid some of these.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the panelists. And I have a quick question to each one of y'all. Same question, Mr. Scott. I'd like you to start it off. What does successful implementation of FITARA look like?
I think I mentioned earlier, to me, it's faster delivery. It's really speed. It's efficiency of our spend. It's projects that are on time and on budget. And meeting the mission that they were designed for, they're secure, and that we have a modern infrastructure that those things run on. And if we did those things, I think we would declare this a success.
Ms. Rung?
Congressman, while I appreciate all the kind words about the guidance, I know that the hard work begins today. And in addition to everything that Tony just articulated, for me, success is IT acquisitions comes off the high-risk list.
Mr. Spires?
I would certainly echo those sentiments. I would add to it, you know, CIOs and IT organizations in the federal government aren't there but to do anything else but to help ensure that the mission and the business of government is done in the agency in which they live, right? So what I would add to that is I'd like to see a set of success criteria beyond what was just discussed that also talks about how it is that the IT organization is going to partner with the mission in order to figure out effectiveness measures so that 3 years to 5 years from now, that agency is operating more effectively than it is today through the use of information technology or enhanced by information technology.
Mr. Powner?
So before I talk about acquisitions, I'd like to talk about operations because I think success starts with moving, and in my testimony, we have that breakdown of how much we spend on legacy systems versus new development. There's a lot of savings on data center consolidation and portfolio stat. That's 2 of the 7 provisions in FITARA. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get out of this inefficient spend on legacy and find a way to move that money into the modernization bucket. And then success in the modernization bucket is quicker delivery. We talked a lot about processes, and those processes will help us get there. But if we don't move money from these old archaic systems to new technologies, we're not going to be successful. And if we don't ultimately deliver the new technologies quicker, that's not success.
Excellent. Thank you. I'd like to yield to Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was a great question. And if I were to answer it, I'd say certainly 2 things. One is we can identify billions of savings that currently are inefficiently used. That's a definite metric on whether it's working or not. And secondly, can we get to a culture whereby we don't treat technology as a commodity to be purchased and managed? We see it rather as a transformative process that can completely reshape how we provide services and manage those services for the citizens we serve. Mr. Chairman, I just want to, on a personal note, in addition to thanking these panelists who've really been partners in the enterprise here, I want to thank 2 staff members who shepherded this legislation through 2 Congresses with 2 very different members of Congress coming together, nonetheless, and finding common ground, working with our Senate colleagues through a change over there that was not easy. And that's Rich Butel, who's in the audience today. Thank you, Rich. He worked on the majority staff and worked in a very bipartisan way under not always easy circumstances and deserves a lot of credit. And Ben Roadside behind me and my staff, who partnered with Rich, also in a bipartisan manner. And there was no trial or tribulation too difficult for them. And they approached this with a wonderful creative spirit, and I am in their debt.
And as we continue to conduct oversight over the implementation of FITARA and IT acquisition reform, one of the things that the IT and Government Ops subcommittees plan on doing is issuing regular scorecards and implement a grading system for compliance based on the rules and regulations of FITARA. I look forward to working with Ranking Member Kelly, Vice Chair Farenthold, Chairman Meadows, Representative Connolly, and members of the subcommittee on this issue. And I would like to thank our witnesses for taking the time to appear before us today. And if there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittees stand adjourned.